Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I'm director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and I'm joined by two guests, Dr. Warren Trenchard, a professor of New Testament studies and the history of Christianity at La Sierra. And you also take care of graduate students in the HMS Richards Divinity School. Thank you for joining us again as we're thinking about New Testament things. You helped us with Roman and Greek religions and with intertestamental literature. Now we've come to the end of the Gospel accounts and the Passion Week, and thank you for joining us. And Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra. Also is a co-director of some archaeological projects and of our center as well. So we have moved through the Gospels. And we've done it kind of as a group, thinking about variations, yes, but thinking about the stories as a whole as we've moved through them. And we've come now to the last episode on the Gospels, and that is the Passion Week. Lots and lots of things to talk about with this particular attempt at connecting Bible with archaeology. So I want to get right into that, and I want Kent to begin talking about some artifacts that might be on the table right next to him.
Well, we have certainly some objects here that we can associate with death and preparation for a burial. This is an ossuary. It's part of the practice of a secondary burial where once the body has decayed, usually after about a year, the bones are collected and placed in a stone box, and it makes room in the tomb for other individuals of the family. Here we have a nail representative, again, of the spikes with which crucifixions.
A Roman one, yes.
Right, a Roman one. Roman crucifixions certainly utilized spikes. They were not always systematic. They experimented with different ways, but nailing was one of the more common. And then we have a glass vessel here. This is actually coal, so this would be for makeup. And the makeup would be put in one side and the applicator in the other. We have a number of small vessels I think you're going to introduce.
Tell us about the coins over on your side,
yes.
In the corner.
Yes, the coins, these are silver coins, and we think of stories in the Gospel throughout, but especially with the account of Judas and the selling of Jesus for a bag of silver coins.
Right. Now, and then if we move across the table, we have a couple of small vessels, probably for something related to cosmetics, I suppose. One of them is alabaster. We do read about an alabaster vessel in the Passion narratives. The other one is probably limestone. I mean, they're related, the same family of stone. And then we have several smaller vessels. This one probably for some kind of liquid, perhaps used domestically. We don't have any reason to connect it with a burial service or ritual service in particular. And then we have several vessels. Some are ceramic and some are Roman glass that have small openings. And I think typically, can't we go to something precious, some kind of precious oil or unguent when we think about these smaller openings?
That's right. They're obviously not wanting to spill it, but preserve it, so a very small opening.
Right. And the glass, you talked about a glass piece, and then we have several pieces here, all with these small openings, all probably used for something special, and ointment, perfume of some kind. The Romans didn't invent glass, but they learned how to blow glass. And in the process, we have spectacular vessels to talk about and to think about. And then two Roman lamps. These are both Herodian, so they would be very much at home in Palestine. And we need to think about this kind of lamp with that kind of snout on them as the lamps in the story of the 10 maidens. All 10 had a lamp, but not all had extra oil. And these would not hold very much oil. Maybe, what, a couple hours? I don't know how much experimentation.
Yeah, 1 to 2 hours, I think, in replicas.
Right. And then from a collection of one of our colleagues who has passed away and donated several things from his museum. The crown of thorns, it's a standard thing. You can pick them up in lots of places, but it certainly gives us a feel for the Passion and the Passion narrative. I should say that we need to thank Christina Reed, a PhD student now at UCR, but who has been working in our center for a number of years, for always putting our collections together of things to think about and see as we discuss different topics. We're in the Passion Week, and so the illustrations, the slide that we look at, are going to be located in that last week of Jesus' life and in Jerusalem. Kent, we have a chronology of Roman rulers. These are Roman, client, I guess we could talk about. Certainly Herod the Great is a client king. So who do we have here that's important for the Passion Week?
Well, we have to move down a little bit down the list. Of course, Herod the Great's gone. Herod Archelaus didn't last long because he had all of the sort of violent streaks of his father, but not the political astuteness. So Herod Antipas and Herod Philip, but if for the final week we bring Herod Antipas, well, he's for the Tetrarch of Galilee, and Perea.
Yeah.
And it's because of this, Jesus is from Galilee, of course he's associated also with Perea, that Pilate attempts to hand him back to remove himself from the matter.
Okay, and then geographically, locating ourselves, Jerusalem, everything happens in or around Jerusalem. So, Warren, if you look at this map, there's something off to the right side, that is the eastern side, and then we have a few locations in the city. How are you thinking about some of these?
Well, certainly the temple was the center of probably religious and commercial life and cultural experience in Jerusalem. It's the place that people flock to in their periodic migrations to Jerusalem for festivals and special occasions and so forth. You know, the house of Caiaphas here in the upper city figures in the story. Other things, of course, figure in the story of Jesus in the various Gospels. Right. Pool of Bethesda.
Including the Mount of Olives off to the right,
Olives,
and the Garden of Gethsemane.
Garden of Gethsemane obviously figures in all of the stories. So, I mean, you look at this, you get a sense of the movement of Jesus coming into the city the week before his crucifixion, or the beginning of that week.
Yeah.
And some of these events, the temple figures during that week several times.
So it's all very tight geographically, isn't it? We're not talking
not a very large geographic area.
Right. And for these important events, which show up in all of the Gospels. Warren, you see the list here, and they're put in at least my best attempts at chronological order. I don't know if that's where scholarship is these days. I think so.
That's certainly the conventional wisdom.
Right. And should we anticipate, when we move to the Passion story, should we anticipate similarities in telling? Should we anticipate something that jumps out for one author, maybe because of an audience situation? How should we think about Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John?
Well, first of all, a scholar at the beginning of the 20th century made an interesting remark concerning the Gospel of Mark. He said, we should understand the Gospel of Mark as a passion story with a long introduction. Now, this makes a lot of sense for a variety of reasons. For one thing, that's what you find there, the large amount of material associated.
Let me go to this next slide here, which illustrates that, I think, quite well.
38%, as you've calculated it, of the Gospel of Mark constitutes the Passion Week or the Passion story or narrative. It gets even larger in the fourth Gospel, as you can see. But these Gospels all came into being in the form in which we have them now in the final third of the first century. Already by this time, Christianity had become a vibrant movement throughout the eastern part of the Mediterranean, had gone all the way to Rome and most of the areas around the Mediterranean. And the message that went out, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, as of first importance, the bottom line of the gospel, if you please, was that Jesus died according to the scriptures and was raised again. So the passion, the experience of Jesus in terms of death, resurrection, was at the very core of Christian teaching. And so it's not surprising then when the story of Jesus is told in terms of what he taught, what he said, what he did, where he went, and so forth, it's told as an enlargement of that essential Christian confession. Yeah. So to see Mark as, and any of the Gospels basically, as passion narratives with long introductions is really very accurate.
It's almost prequel, isn't it? I mean, yeah. you have the story itself, which is central, which is central theologically, which is central in any of these Christian communities, right? I mean, so we're not just talking about Jerusalem.
Right.
We're talking about the communities where the evangelists, the gospel writers, first shared in their ministry and, of course, then resulting in books.
And when Paul, in particular, went out into the Greco-Roman world and brought this message to non-Jews, first of all, to Jews living in those areas, but then very quickly to non-Jews in those areas, it was the same gospel. And these written gospels are all in their originals possessive of a title that says, the gospel, according to.
Right.
So they considered it one gospel, which was the death and resurrection of Jesus. But it was interpreted by, enunciated by, expounded by each of them in their own ways, according to their own understandings of this event.
And those understandings and those means of expression do have some variations which would, I think, as the scholars who study the Gospels would say, would meet particular needs of particular audiences, would follow a particular theme of Matthew, of royalty, or whatever.
That's the most important thing. They each have different understandings for the communities they're writing to, and this comes out. For example, Matthew is very interested to show two essential characteristics of Jesus of Nazareth. He's introduced as the son of Abraham and the son of David. And he immediately launches into a genealogy. Most people don't pay any attention to the genealogy, but it's very instructive because it does not start or does not go all the way back to Adam, as Luke's does, but it starts with Abraham, signaling that Jesus is the quintessential Jew. Right. And then it goes quickly to and focuses not only on David, but David's royal offspring, unlike Luke's genealogy, signaling that he's not only the quintessential Jew, but he is the quintessential king of the Jews. Right. And it's interesting then that when the wise men come from the east, they're looking for the king of the Jews, a story found only in Matthew. Mm-hmm. And so they launch out telling stories from the perspective that they have regarding Jesus. Excellent. And that includes all the way through the Passion story as well. In
particular, maybe the Passion story.
Yes.
And so as we look at Passion Week, just a series, Kent, just walk us through very quickly. There are 2 slides here walking through the kind of the combined event from the Gospels.
Well, Jesus always enters from the east, from the Mount of Olives. So we sometimes have mentioned, along with the entry to Jerusalem, coming through Bethany and Bethphage down over and into the city. We have teachings and parables, which are specific to this passion narrative, significant to the teachings certainly of the end of time. We think of Matthew 24. What will be the signs for the end of the age? Right. Attempts to trap Jesus. It sort of reaches a crescendo where the attempts to trap Jesus then lead to eventually temple events where he comes head-to-head against the establishment there, leading then to the Last Supper in sort of a secretive, sort of tucked away part of the city.
And was it Passover or was it not Passover?
Well, that is the question.
And some of the gospel writers vary a bit on that.
Right.
Okay.
Well, just on that point, you talk about differences in these stories. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have a ceremonial meal, the elements of which are interpreted in terms of Jesus' death that is forthcoming. So it's not unlike a Passover experience. I mean, it's arguably a Passover meal, maybe something else, but it's arguably a Passover meal. You come to the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, however, there is clearly no Passover meal because Passover is not for another 24 hours in that text. And the meal is a fellowship meal, the central focus of which is the washing of the disciples' feet. And so our tradition of a Eucharistic meal, a Passover meal, a communion service, Lord's Supper, that comes from the Synoptic Gospels. The foot washing that we often associate with this comes from the fourth gospel. None of those gospels put those two things together.
Right. So we see several events. Kent, a few more.
Right, he goes before the high priest. We have that narrative before Pilate, who's the Roman representative as governor. We have, don't have the mention here, but Herod is
right. And is that only in one of the
one gospel?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Carrying the cross. Jesus carries his cross.
Except in John. Jesus carries the cross the whole way because theologically Jesus is on his way. Nobody's going to stop him. He's on his way to his coronation, not crucifixion, but coronation, being crowned. And nobody, the Greeks that ask, we would see Jesus? No, don't have time for them right now. No, we don't have time for Simon of Cyrene. Jesus is going to, in fact, Jesus, in standing before these, before Caiaphas and Pilate, but especially Pilate, it's not Jesus standing being judged before Pilate. It's Pilate being judged before Jesus. I mean, these twists are so intriguing and convey this theological theme John wants to present.
Culminates then with the crucifixion, the rest over the Sabbath day, and then the resurrection.
And then finally the resurrection. So some basic issues to think about. I mean, we won't have time to think about these in any detail, but the kind of general architecture artifacts in Roman Judea and in Jerusalem in particular. We do have to think about the temple because we have lots of models now. And we do have evidence of crucifixion, we'll look at that, and of burial practices. So quickly, the temple. Kent, you've been to this model several times. It looks real, but there's a walking path around it.
Right, it's actually around the whole complex.
Right,
So, right. And you look down at different parts of the reconstructed city. So we're looking there from the east, like we're coming down, or maybe standing on the Mount of Olives. The temple opened to the east. You see the courtyard, you see the porticos, so the columned porches that go all the way around, especially the royal stoa there on the southern or the left-hand side, probably where Jesus confronted the money changers. Right. And then the Antonia fortress is also pictured there in the back left hand of the temple here.
And you can actually see it in the backdrop here.
That's right. Important because this is where the garrison of Roman soldiers were stationed, and especially during the Jewish festivals.
Right. And then a couple of gateways here.
Coming up from the south, there were double gateways. You would enter from one side and descend from through the other. These actually go up through the foundations, and then you emerge from a stairway onto the plaza.
Right. And then the modern, at least the eastern one, has three arches to it.
Right,
That's
it's rebuilt in the
Right.
Arab period.
Right. Oh, some interesting artifacts. Both of these are artifacts. One of them is from the Byzantine period, probably 6th century, and it is a plaque, and it's been carved. Rather traditional, wouldn't you say? But it is an artifact on its own terms. The way that Christians thought about, that is, Christians a few centuries after Christ thought about it. But what about this graffiti, this graffito, singular, on the right? What is that saying about the crucifixion?
Look at the face, the head. So it's certainly mocking, putting a donkey head on this on the crucified representation of Jesus, and then it has the believer. It has his name, and it says he's worshiping his God.
Right, and there's the donkey.
Yep.
So that's interesting, especially this is 3rd century. By the time we get to the early part of the 4th century, Christianity becomes the official Roman religion. So this is only part way. This doesn't last, this particular sentiment. It becomes that is, Christianity becomes the official religion and is thought of positively. We've seen a nail on our table of artifacts. Here are some other examples, Roman nails. Okay. What do these images depict?
We have very few examples that we can identify as crucified individuals. Probably a couple reasons. Many of them would be thrown out on the garbage heaps and consumed by the feral dogs. Those who were buried, retrieved by family members, how would you know they were crucified? The nails probably didn't pierce the bones most of the time. And so what mark would they leave? Maybe a scratch mark that you wouldn't notice on the bone itself. In the case of this man, in his ossuary, he was identified as Yochanan. One of the nails remains in his ankle bone, and there's a model on the left, and it looks like either a very good model or the actual photo of it on the right. When it was pounded into the olive wood cross, we know it was olive wood, the nail hit a knot and bent.
We can't see it so well here, but if we could turn this three-dimensionally, we would see it's a very significant
It's actually
bend.
curved towards us, yeah.
Right.
And so they couldn't pull it out, and they just hacked that chunk out, and buried him with the nail still through his ankle.
So we do have archaeological connections with the very
Found in
practice.
Jerusalem. Mm-hmm.
Found in Jerusalem of that. A site at which I cut my archaeological teeth, Tel Heshban, or Heshbon in Jordan. And it is remarkable that it preserved, actually I think two, Roman period, what we call rolling stone tombs. And if one steps into this very low entrance, one has to bend way over, then one sees the, sometimes called loculi, sometimes called, what's the other term?
Kochim.
Yeah, kochim is the Hebrew term.
Hebrew, right.
Isn't it, right? And then a bench here for putting bodies on, preparing them. It's so illustrative of the story of the burial of Jesus.
And authentic. This is first century.
Yes,
this is the right
absolutely so.
kind of tomb.
Absolutely so. Then we have lots of inscriptions, and we'll try to go through these fairly quickly, but there are several. Centurions. A centurion is mentioned in the story of people gathered around the cross. We have some ossuary, some stone box inscriptions, and an inscription dealing with Pontius Pilate. So here, this first century tombstone, I'm not sure where in Jerusalem this was found, but in any case, a centurion. We read about the centurion at the cross. The connection is intriguing. I mean, we're not trying to identify this with that centurion, but with that particular group of people. Kent, what do we have here?
Well, this is an ossuary from a tomb excavated not that many years ago, a couple decades perhaps, in the southern part of Jerusalem, that appears to be from the family, the high priestly family of Caiaphas. And it's actually inscribed. It says Caiaphas bar, I think it's Yosef. So Caiaphas, it's the Aramaic form of the name Caiaphas. That's the Greek version that we're familiar with. And it's believed that this is very probably Caiaphas himself, buried here.
Very nicely decorated. This is not for the people of the land, the Am Haaretz that we often read about in the literature. Another discovery here is this one, this stone box, quite unlike our very simple and small, maybe child's ossuary on the table. Where does this one come from, and why did it generate so much energy, Kent?
Well, this turned up in an Israeli collector's, well, it was in his...
in his shop.
In his shop, sitting on the toilet when it was photographed. Yeah. He claims he didn't realize until he had someone more expert look at it, that it had an inscription on it that actually says it belongs to Joseph.
To James.
James, excuse me, Yaakov. James, the brother of Yeshua, or Jesus.
Right, so James, son Bar, so Aramaic, Yosef of Joseph, and then that last part there. And that's where the debate comes from?
Everybody seems to think the first part of the inscription is probably legit, probably original. The question is whether the final two words, brother of Jesus, was added. There's a little bit of a crack that runs through there. Is the handwriting different? All of these questions have been brought to this. And while many people feel it's fake, it's not as certain as some of the other artifacts that we know are fake.
Right, right. As a New Testament scholar, how do you think about this?
Well, I mean, obviously, if this were to prove to be authentic, it would be extremely significant. But all of these names are very common at the
Remember
time.
that. We must remember that.
And so even the collocation of this set of names wouldn't necessarily be deemed to be unusual, I don't think.
Right. Okay, an inscription found at Caesarea
Caesarea,
or Caesarea Maritima along the sea. And why is this so important, Ken?
This is the first contemporary inscription. Okay, Josephus mentions him, but this is the actual inscription that mentions Pilate. And so this is very significant because we know about Pilate from the Bible. People want to question, do we know of Pilate, do we know of the end of Jesus from extra-biblical history sources? We can at least affirm that Pilate was a real individual.
Right. In this monumental, we call this a monumental inscription. Righto. Lots of different kinds of artifacts. We won't have time to look at all of these. We've actually looked at some ossuaries, and we have temple and cultic related sorts of things. I am going to show a slide of something I studied once, the Shroud of Turin, which actually was made not as a burial cloth of Jesus, was made in the 13th century, 13th or 14th century, so it's medieval. But people have thought about it, and it's a part of the worship of pilgrims going to northern Italy and so on. But when I gave a paper on it several years ago, I said, let's wait for the carbon-14 dating. And that was the security that locked it into the medieval period. But it's not something in Jerusalem, never was, but in any case. So we have different locations to think about too. Let me just think about and have you help me with a couple of them. The Sadducean Quarter.
They lived on the Western Hill. They very privileged location, looking across at the temple, and they apparently didn't have much of a problem accommodating Roman-style architecture. And
Status quo wasn't too bad for them.
that's right. We see the mosaic floors. We see beautiful villas.
Right. Now, we don't have time to get to the image, to the picture, but the debate about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb. Just quickly, just in a few seconds. Where do we go with that?
My personal view, I think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre marks the location. The tombs are of the right time period. The tradition is early. It was just outside the city walls at the time Jesus was buried.
What do you think?
I agree. I think the Garden Tomb is a beautiful, kind of sentimental place that is conducive to worship and all this kind of thing.
Right.
But I don't think it, as unlikely site as the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre is, I mean the church, it likely is at the spot.
All right. Thanks, Warren. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.